Well, ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all wish you croeso, fáilte riamh, and welcome. This session is Wales and Scotland, Indigenous languages of the UK contemporary literature. Perhaps not the most mellifluous of titles, but I think you get the point, and you certainly will do by the end of the session. Of course, amidst the multifarious and multicultural weave of modern Britain, there are 7 indigenous languages. Working up from the southwest, we have Cornish, Welsh, Manx, Scots Gaelic, and then on the other side of the other bit of the UK, we have Irish, and of course we have English. Now, our featured languages this morning, in this morning's session, will be Gaelic, Scots, and Welsh. But of course, we will also be discussing their relationship, literary and otherwise, with the English language. Now, I'm surrounded by 4 distinguished panelists, or I have on either side of me, I should say, rather, 4 distinguished panelists who are all actively involved with writing and publishing in their respective indigenous languages. On the right, we have Angus Campbell. Angus is a first language Gaelic speaker. In 1992, no less an authority than Sorley MacLean, described him as one of the few really significant living poets in Scotland writing in any language. Indeed, some accolade. He publishes in English as well as in Gaelic, and his novel, Aniha Musta Helshin, the Night Before We Sailed, was nominated as one of the 100 best ever books from Scotland in 2005. On my left here is James Robertson, who is a writer and champion of the Scots language. He's written 6 novels for adults amongst his work in other genres. His Testament of Gideon Mac was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2006. He's also actively involved in publishing with the Catalonia imprint and Ichiku, which specialises in publishing work in the Scots language for young people and children. I'm sorry that I keep popping this microphone. Next to me here is Alys Conran. Alys's first language is Welsh, but she writes mostly in English. She's a poet, short story writer, a lecturer in creative writing at Bangor University, and her debut novel, Pigeon, swept the board at last year's Wales Book of the Year awards. She won the category prize for fiction, she won the audience prize, and of course she won the big prize, the Wales Book of the Year. At the end is Sian Northey. Shan, another native Welsh speaker. Shan translated Alys's debut novel, and Pigeon, I think I mentioned the name of the novel, Pigeon was published simultaneously in both Welsh and in English. That's something we'll come back to and discuss later. Shan, of course, is a writer in her own right. Her first volume of poems, Trwy Ddyddiau Gwydr, Through Days of Glass, was shortlisted for Wales Book of the Year Poetry Award in 2013. She's also published short form fiction and novels, and she works frequently in the community. She's been involved with writing projects with sufferers of dementia, with prisoners, and she will shortly be a poet in residence at the Blaenau Festiniog Food Bank. Please welcome our panelists. Well, as I'm sure all of us could learn something about some of the languages that we'll be featuring today, we'll commence by asking each of the panelists to say a little bit about their own linguistic and literary traditions, and also read a short piece of their own work. And we're going to start with Angus.
Taplet, are you hearing us okay? Because I can't hear a single word. I'm just in a kind of world of my own. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Gaelic Mod, which is the 19th century equivalent of the Eisteddfod. But if you went to the Gaelic Mod, it's like going to church, and they would ask you all to stand now and sing Land of the Fathers, or Tokavi, Cananur Tuche, Tokavi, Suesrico, Hineving Roch Lucher, He Horokavi, Toeslishing Gaelic. So, Gaelic. Gaelic has got 57,000 Gaelic speakers at the last count in the census in 2011. And of course, they're all related to me. They're all cousins of mine. And they all read my books. We are a traditionally oral culture. Literacy, because of the whole political, educational desecration of my language, was robbed from Gaelic speakers. My father and my mother and that whole generation couldn't read or write in Gaelic. It's only in the last 25 years that literacy through Gaelic medium education in schools has become possible for my children and for coming generations. So to be a Gaelic writer in the 21st century is quite challenging in the sense of, A, you've got the 57,000 native Gaelic speakers, but of those, how many read? 1,000? 2,000? The structure of Gaelic publishing consists of the Gaelic Books Council, which has an annual budget of £250,000, which I think buys a couple of oysters for Theresa May, is that her name, once a week. 250,000 is the annual budget for Gaelic publishing. There are 5 of us staff. It began in 1968 with 1. After 6 years, they got 2, and these 2 valiantly worked for the next 20 years in terms of Gaelic publishing, until a 3rd member was added in 1997. So we're pretty poorly off in terms of financial backing and in terms of readership. But what we do have is a political goodwill cross-party in Scotland, and a kind of leverage that makes Gaelic a part of an international, multicultural, multilingual Scotland, whereby for the first time in several generations, my children are not ashamed to own and possess their own language. Now that's a kind of just a quick resume of a few things to do with Gaelic. My own writing, I wrote this epic novel, Untitled Chapter, in 2004, and I don't know if this technology works. I press it at someone. There it is. And I realized at that time, because we were an oral culture, nobody had written War and Peace in Gaelic. So I went about writing War and Peace in Gaelic. And it's a boy at the edge of a loch in 1913 about to throw a skimmer across the loch, and is in South Uist. And is about to throw it, he hears horses' hooves, and it's the new parish priest is riding his white horse through Uist. And the boy thinks, power, that's what I want to be. I want to be a priest. And he enters the priesthood to seek power. And the novel finishes 100 years later, having gone through the Spanish Civil War and the entire 20th century till the year 2013, where a young boy of the same age of 13 is standing at the edge of a loch with a skimmer and thinks, you know what, I'll make a film of this book, because the film medium is the medium of the 21st century. Interestingly, I got an email the other day from Steve Coogan's company saying, are the film rights for Untitled Chapter available? And I said, yes, they are, but the novel is in Gaelic. Can you read Gaelic? And of course, they said, no, we can't read Gaelic. So that's an interesting kind of door or half door, whether this Gaelic novel should be translated into English for a bigger market. The second slide is just an indication of a hand-drawn map of part of the area of South Uist which the novel covers. And there is page 1 of it, which I can't read backwards and I can't remember what it said. I think it says, am I right? Che re vik. Oh, I can't do it from memory. He'd spent the morning looking for a stone, the right kind of stone, and etc., etc. So, and I'll skip past these two, and I'll go backwards. Can I go back? That's the wrong slide, but anyway. There's a poem I want to share with you. It's called Botach na Gaelic. I'll read it in Gaelic and English because I'll read very fast. Botach na Gaelic. Vich canan illa ike. Kainch nach titiga parentan. Lan runakan is yalanich. Vich zgarige kumu. Rachaga na chanyanach. Chara fara kid eiren. Jo fe met bidikash garage. Skiega chulishian. Een kiachan chatriana agus rutan. Na chattel fatan la at savashinjas and skull. Snud hittig an eintje, begissen het chosh, a clich tig etter na skahan. Smir a bek in the leemshinje, viga clich kan shin, kashiri. I've read part of this amazing novel Pigeon by Alys, and I was just blown over by it. And when I met her this morning, I said, you know what? I wish I'd written that novel. You know those novels you want, why didn't I write that? But then I told to Alys, I says, I couldn't have written it because I'm too old. And then she confessed she's too old now as well to have written it. And it's strange because it's my children's language and it's my children's engagement with the linguistic world they possess. And that poem I read in Gaelic there, I'll just read the English translation for you. It's just a little glimpse into the childhood I had in South Uist in the 1960s, and it's called The Man on the Moon. The man on the moon would speak a different language, one that our parents wouldn't understand, full of stars and lightning. And he could change shape, become a rabbit. Bet he never went to mass, but had to wear short trousers. And bet he could see everything, even Catriana's tits and things. He slept all day while we were at school. And when night fell, he'd be all awake, playing tig between the clouds. And if we hadn't jumped on him, he'd have played there forevermore. Amen, agus amen. Click to go forward, click to go back. I don't know what happened to my...
Okay, thank you very much, Angus. And I now ask James to give us an overview of the Scots publishing.
No, wrong way. Thank you very much. I'm just going to give you a very brief outline of some of the issues facing Scots as a language. One of the differences between Scots and both Welsh and Gaelic is that Scots is a sibling language to English, and that's created a lot of difficulties historically as to its definition. Does it really count as a language, a fully fledged language in its own right? Is it a dialect? Etc., etc. And these are ongoing debates around Scots that frankly bore me quite a lot these days, because the fact of the matter is that Scots exists, and I'm much more interested in trying to provide books in Scots for the very many people who would like to read in Scots. Angus mentioned that Gaelic, until the last generation, was a very much an oral linguistic culture, and that is true also of Scots. There's been relatively little published in Scots in recent years, but if you go back over the last 600, 700, 800 years, there's actually an entire literature in Scots, much of which has been published. And obviously the most famous writer in writing in Scots was Robert Burns. Most of his best poetry, I would submit, was written in Scots. This slide, which I hope you can read, shows you the outcome of the census of 2011. that was the very first time that anybody had asked the question, how many people in Scotland speak Scots? I think I'm right in saying that Gaelic, they had been asking the question since the late 19th century, but nobody had thought that it was worth asking this question until 8 years ago. And the result was pretty spectacular. As you can see, nearly 38% of the population said that they could either read, write, speak or understand Scots. And I think in most European nations, if you suddenly discovered that there was a language that had been living this kind of semi-secret existence and that suddenly that higher percentage of the population were familiar with it, you would need to do something about it. But rather like Gaelic, Scots has had very little done on its behalf in educational terms, and still that is the case. It is officially recognised as a language, but it has a lower linguistic legal status than either English or Gaelic, and so it's the poor relation in some respects at the moment. I tried to estimate how many books are published in Scots every year. It's a very difficult one, but I would think in a good year it might be 20. And if you think about 20 books being divided amongst 1.8 million people, that's not a lot of publishing going on. I thought I would just briefly illustrate some of the other issues around Scots by giving you a couple of other slides. I've labelled this one Language Imperialism. This is a street sign in St Andrews, and I love the fact that they have not just replaced the street name, the Scots street name, with an English street name, but they've actually left it up there to remind us of what has happened. Contrast that with this language survival, a street's name in Auchtermuchty, Bray Head. There's not a huge amount of visual Scots around, but this is a good example of how it survives. I've inserted this slide as an example of language recognition. You'll find increasingly in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland that Gaelic and English are equally represented on road signs, which seems to me a thoroughly good thing. That's not really happened so far with Scots. However, I just put this slide up because this is a really interesting book that was produced a few years ago by a Polish academic who was living in Edinburgh, and she decided that she would produce a wee book to aid her fellow Poles who are coming to live in Scotland in large numbers, but who were under the mistaken impression that they were coming to live in an English-speaking country. And when they spoke to their neighbours or went to work and had to speak to their fellow workers, they discovered often that they were speaking a completely different language. And so this wee book was compiled to help the new residents of Scotland, the Polish residents, understand some of the language that was going on round about them. And again, I think that's an interesting illustration of the multifarious nature of the languages being spoken in Scotland today. I'm involved in a publisher called Itchy Coo. We started up 16 years ago with the express intention of producing books in Scots for young readers. And here's a couple of examples of the translation work we've done. These are two of Roald Dahl's books. The one on the left, The Egypts, was the translation done by my colleague Matthew Fitt of Dahl's The Twits. And I did the version of the fantastic Mr. Fox, Sleek at Mr. Todd. And these have sold in very, very large numbers indeed. The Egypts, I think I'm right in saying, has sold about 40 or 50,000 copies, which demonstrates that there is a huge appetite for books in Scots if you can provide them. And we have an interesting example here. There are now young people in Scotland who have read the Egypts before they read the Twits, which actually makes an interesting it's an interesting challenge to the sort of linguistic hierarchies that we're used to in this country. We've now published, I think I'm right in saying, about 65 or 70 titles in Scots over the last 15 or 16 years, which is great on the one hand, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to the number of books being published in English at the same period. I've just finally Another example, this is a translation of Winnie the Pooh that I did a few years ago. And it's what I would call a kind of light Scots. It's intended to encourage folk that are used to reading in English to start to read in Scots. So it's not too difficult to read off the page if you're only used to reading in English. And finally, something a wee bit more dense. I'll read this. This is a poem that I wrote for the Scottish Parliament back in 2004 when it moved into its new building. It's a manifesto for members of the Scottish Parliament. It's a sonnet. I won't try to explain everything that's going on in it, but I deliberately wrote it in quite a dense Scots because I thought it would be useful for the members of the Parliament to have to work away at it a wee bit in order to din it into their heads what they were there for. So the first 8 lines of the sonnet are don't do this, don't do that kind of instructions, and then the last 6 lines are more positive things about what they should be doing. So I'll just read that out to you. Dinna be gleicet, dinna be our smert, dinna craw crus, dinna be unca blate, dinna breen gin, dinna be always late, dinna steek your lugs, dinna steek your heart, dinna be sleeket, dinna be a sook, dinna creesh nae loof for future favour, dinna swick nor swither, hash nor haver, dinna be sour of face and dinna duke. Open your earns and minds to folk in need, hain frae filing and skaith the land and sea, tak tent of justice and the common weal, ding doon hypocrisy, wan thrift and greed, hease up the banner o' humanity, seek out the truth, and to the truth be leal. Thank you.
And we turn our attention now to Wales and to Alys Conran.
Do we want to start with English or? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Welsh literature in English, and then I think Shan will talk about Welsh literature in Welsh. It's very difficult, of course, to define things like publishing figures with Welsh literature in English, because where do you start and end? Where does Welsh literature in English begin? Do we just take writers who were born in Wales? Do we take writers who are writing only on a Welsh theme? Do we accept into, the fold people who are writing about Wales who are not living in Wales or who are not from Wales? So I'm not going to define this in numerical terms, but I think the interesting thing here is that there's a great difference in Welsh literature in Welsh and Welsh literature in English in terms of just the history of this beast. That Welsh literature in Welsh, of course, goes back to the 6th century, and Welsh literature in English emerges far later, of course, and it's difficult to know exactly where it does, but you could say maybe the 17th century. Some people would say with John Dyer or writers of that ilk, and then some people would say no, it doesn't emerge until the 20th century with Caradog Evans, and where you have writers that are really talking about Welsh cultural identity, or someone like Alan Raine in the 19th century actually, talking about a separate social identity in Welsh culture. And then there's the question of who are we writing to and who are we writing for? Who are we talking to? Where are we writing from about Wales? Which I think Caradog Evans, who is a very controversial figure still, really focalises those questions. A lot of people thinking about Welsh writing in English will, of course, identify Dylan Thomas, R.S. Thomas, perhaps Owen Shears, and then maybe their knowledge will kind of peter out at that point, I think. And the impression that I want to leave you with is just how broad, how diverse, how dynamic a field of writing this field of writing is in Wales today, and how dynamic it has been for many years now. So I'm writing into a field in which there are multifarious voices, in which English is reconfigured, has been reconfigured before me by people like Dylan Thomas, of course, who you will know. You will recognise those cadences in Dylan Thomas that often you find in Welsh literature in English, sometimes coming from the Welsh language, in fact. So there's a lot of borrowing across into English language writing from Welsh. There's a lot of bilingual writers at work in English, and I am one of them. In fact, I think bilingualism in the population of Welsh writers in English is probably far above the national average. So, for example, I was on a residency with 4 other Welsh writers in English, and in fact, the language that we spoke to each other was Welsh. So we were all, perhaps our Welsh was in general. You said it was my first language. It is a first language. It's ever so slightly weaker than my English, depending on the context that I'm in and how my life's going at that time. And often that's the way with Welsh writers in English. So they do use both languages. They draw from both. And Welsh writers in Welsh also, of course, are bilingual. And I think this is a really important facet that we're not talking about. We're not talking about literatures in isolation from each other. We're talking about literatures in dialogue with each other and in dialogue with a lot of international literature beyond Wales as well. Just to talk briefly about Pidgin, I would say, firstly, I'm not the only writer in Wales working between Welsh and English. You have someone like Fflir Dafydd, who writes a novel in Welsh and a novel in English that correspond to each other. I'm not sure if I would call them translations. There may be adaptations, but there are a lot of writers that are moving between the two. But Pidgin was published last year. Was it last year? 16. Okay, sorry, I'm losing track of days. But and it really tells the story of a boy and a girl and their friendship. But also, it's a book about language and about the loss of language. Hence the title, Pidgin. Because they move between Welsh and English. It's a book in which Welsh is kept present. So there is quite a bit of Welsh within the text. It's often not translated. It's often relayed to the reader in different ways, so using various kinds of sort of code switching and things throughout the novel. And it's a novel about Northwest Wales, and it's a post-industrial novel about Northwest Wales. So in that way, I think it maybe challenges some ideas about what it is to be North Walian. I think I'll read you a little bit from the English version, because Pidgin was published bilingually. Shan translated it into Welsh. I didn't do that work myself. And the Welsh version is also a kind of hybrid text that moves between Welsh and English. I read a very short extract because I don't think that concentration levels in this environment will last very long, but okay. So it opens with the ice cream van arriving up into the hills on a cold January day when it's raining. The ice cream man, Glyn's, looking down at us through the slot. He has thick, bristly black eyebrows and little dark blue eyes. He has a belly like a pot. Glyn's skin's different to mine or Pidgin's. Glyn's skin is tanned and like oiled leather. On his head, there's some black hair he brushes over his bald patch. This hair always ends up sticking straight up, like a by mistake Mohican. He has black hairs all up his arms too, and Glyn has a hairy face. Not long hair, just bristly like my dad's was. Glyn's voice is bristly too. And he has what Eva calls a stutter, where there's a blank space where your word should be, and your whole body stops. Iawn, but boys, he asks us. Together, Pidgin and me breathe iawn back. Although everyone knows I'm not a boy, any more than Pidgin is a pretty hogan, but I quite like being called a boy by Glyn. But be dach chi isio heddiw ta? Glyn's question goes up at the end, really high as here. But we still haven't decided. Waiting, Glyn, to keep talking, says, tywydd braf, and he grins. We grin back because this is no more fine weather than Pigeon is a Hogan, or I'm a boy, or Gwyn's van's a BMW, or we're all Colin Jackson doing the hurdles.
Diolch yn fawr. And last but not least, Sian Northey.
Diolch yn fawr, Iwan. I always smile when I listen to Pigeon because you know that wonderful relationship you have as an aunt to a child. You can boast and you can be really proud in a way that you're more proud, openly proud of your own children. I write in Welsh and I only write in Welsh so far. As Alys points out, everybody in Wales is bilingual, but I would certainly say that I would be less confident in English, and certainly a different writer. Some quick statistics about the Welsh language. The last census told us that slightly less than 20% of the population of Wales spoke English. If I get any of this wrong, my partner, Shan, there will quickly correct me, so wave! So that means there's about 500,000 people who claim to speak Welsh. That's in Wales. There are rough estimates, there might be as many as that again spread out throughout the world. And that does make a difference when you're talking about literature, and especially online literature. Education through the medium of Welsh is growing. The call for it is growing. That's comparatively new in that my children, my grandchildren are taught through the medium of Welsh. I, after primary school, was taught through the medium of English. And there was no choice about that. My sister was the first one to do her O-levels in one subject, history, at the school in Glyn, and Glyn is 80, 90, even higher at that point, Welsh speaking, and she was the only one, and she did it off her own bat, did all her own translation. So that situation has changed very much within my lifetime. My own writing, I think the last time that Ifor introduced me, he described me as a Swiss Army knife. As he said, I do a bit of everything, perhaps not the best tool for the job, but she'll do. So I write for adults, I write for children, I translate, write poetry. For my sins, I've written soap opera scripts, anything that'll give me some cash and enable me to carry on working with words in Welsh. As Ifor also mentioned, I do quite a lot of work in the community on various projects. I'm lucky I live in an area where the percentage in my village, I think, is still not far from 80%. 78, 79% are Welsh speakers. And Gwynedd in general is one of the highest areas. So I can work in the community through the medium of Welsh. And I'll finish by reading you a poem that arose from some of the work I've done in the community with people who live with dementia. It's fairly short, so I'll read it first in Welsh and then in English. Bodawen in the title is a care home I visited. Oh, what have I done? Always print it out. Oh, excuse me, no. I'm so sorry. I will carry on. Can you see iBooks, please? Oh, While Shan faffs.
Hello. While Shan finds her poem,
which was there.
It's nearly there.
It was there.
I'll jump ahead.
Jump ahead. Sorry, Ifor.
One of the things I was keen to pick up on, one of the things that unites all the writers on the panel, and myself. I'm not sure if I introduced myself at the beginning. I'm Ifor Glyn. I'm the National Poet of Wales. And if I did introduce myself at the beginning, as I was supposed to do, I apologise for apparently being so self-important. I feel I have to introduce myself twice. We're all products of a bilingual culture, and we sometimes forget. I will return to that point later.
Yes, carry on introducing yourself, Ifor.
No. Well, come back to that.
Huge apologies. And I thought, I'm not going to use an ESB and clever slides. I'm going to keep it simple. Bod Owen in the poem is the care home I visited. And I wrote, Ar ôl Bod Owen is the title, and it says, after leaving Bod Owen. Ar ôl Bod Owen. Weithiau, roeddan ni, hi a fi, yn ei gweld yn dianc, yn sglefrio I ffwrdd i'w rhyddid ym mhatrymer carpedi, ymhygiadau'r llenni ac ymysg ei ffrindiau ar y radio. Ac yna roedd angen I hamgylchynu a lasw disgrifio. Ddim ceffil, mwy na dafad, ei llusgo nôl i'w priod le neu'n cega. Biwch? Ia, biwch. Corlanwyd gair awn ymlaen ar sgwrs. A finnau wrth gerdded adref yn enwi fy myd fel plentyn blwydd, rhag ofn i'r diawliad yn ystywall, lithro cyn pryd I guddio yn beth ti'n galw ar ochr lôn. After a visit to Bod Owen, sometimes we, she and I, would see them escaping, sliding away to their freedom between the carpet swirls, in the folds of the curtains, and amongst their friends on the radio. And then they had to be surrounded by the lasso of description. Not a horse, bigger than a sheep. We drag them back to their rightful place in our mouths. A cow, yes, a cow. A word corralled, our conversation continues. And as I walk home, I name my world like a toddler, in case the crafty buggers slip too soon to hide in the whatchamacallits by the side of the road.
Thank you very much. Well, there's a perception perhaps that the languages, the literatures that we've been introduced to in the first part of this session are that they're perhaps marginal. The Gaelic, the Scots, the Welsh, that they are somehow marginal to the majority experience. However, I would posit against that in some ways they're actually part of a majority. That is to say, as they're all products of cultures which are to some extent less or more or less bilingual, that places us actually as part of the global norm, because although figures regarding how many people speak more than one language are a little sketchy, the conservative estimates place that around at least half, and the more generous estimates upwards to 75%, 80% of the world population speak more than one language. So to speak more than one language and to produce work in the other language is actually, when you think about it like that, it actually makes you think, right, we're not some odd people, we're actually the normal people. We are the normal people. Of course, we do live at the geographical margins, at least, of one of the more monoglot cultures, or one of the Anglo-American culture does tend to emphasize one language perhaps at the expense of others, but there we are. However, as part of our different language groups, the 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million Scots speakers, the 500, 600,000 Welsh speakers, the 60,000 Gaelic speakers. Whilst they're all internally viable, if we wish to engage with a wider world, then translation has to come into play. We've already come across translation in various guises in the conversation so far. A simultaneous translation of Alys's book, the decision or the situation thus far that Angus's novel hasn't been translated. James, of course, is actively engaged in translation. Perhaps more so into Scots than out of Scots. What are our relationships to translation? And I'm going to ask Alys to kick us off.
I speak as the daughter of one of the foremost translators, actually, from Welsh into English. So this is a matter that's very, very dear to my heart. And I think one of the things that I would like to see in Wales, one of the things that I think is absolutely vital to our culture across the board, both in Welsh and in English, is a greater valorization of the work of translation, and a sense that chance we can lead in a way in presenting to the world what translation really means to culture, because for our culture it is so vital, it is so central to the communication across these language boundaries. And at the moment we're perhaps not fully engaging with some of these conversations, and we really could be. So for example, we tend to say Shan is a writer in her own right, as though translation was not writing in your own right in some way. Whereas I really, really believe that it should be. We had a fascinating conference just last week in Bangor about expanded translation, where people came from all over the world to have these conversations about what translation can do and how can we struggle to move from one language to the other, acknowledging what is lost. And when we're talking about translation from Welsh into English, what is lost becomes very important. We don't want to say this is a complete translation, because we want to mark the place of our grief when we can't speak and understand that language. We need that space to be left open. So we need to look at creative ways of translation. And I think Wales and places where minority languages are spoken could be leading the way in that way. So translation into English, by all means, of Welsh literature. But also I think there's a strong drive in Wales to kind of leapfrog that issue, because there's so many things that cause difficulties for us culturally in the English market. There's the question of the contemporaneity of Welsh experience, whether that can be fully acknowledged across the border, whether we are allowed to be fully contemporary in theme, let alone language. And then there's also the question of translation into Welsh. And I would like to see an awful lot more of that happening. It is happening. Pidgin was translated into Welsh, but I would like to see so many texts from abroad translated into Welsh and brought into Welsh. I'd like to see us follow the Catalan example that I have seen. So many wonderful works brought into Catalan, and that is very inspiring. And you see this sort of cross-pollination across these minority language boundaries. So that's what I would say about translation.
Yeah, I think Scots is very interesting in relation to translation. There's been a huge amount of work translated into Scots, but very little translated from Scots into other languages. So Scots is a really good receiving language. Historically, there's been a huge amount of work from French, for example, translated into Scots. There's a great tradition of the plays of Molière being translated into Scots and have been performed over many decades. Eddie Morgan, the late great poet, translated from many, many different languages, often into Scots. And I could name French, Spanish, and most other European languages have been languages that have from which Scots has taken work and reproduced them in its own way, and that has an interesting impact. When I translated Winnie the Pooh, for example, which is from English directly into Scots, it actually had an interesting impact upon the characters in the book. Christopher Robin, who I've always reckoned to be a bit of a dreep. became quite a kind of gallus, bold character once he was speaking Scots. Don't ask me why. Ifor, who was, I renamed him hee-haw, which is a Scots phrase meaning absolutely nothing, which seemed very suitable for his pessimistic character. He became even more dour and depressing in Scots than he was in English. That's a kind of slightly frivolous example, but it is true that the act of translation does actually mean that you have to revisit texts. And I like the idea that actually often translations are not really translations, but they're versions. You can't reproduce in one language what has been written in another accurately, so you produce as close a version as you can to it. So I think in terms of building up a canon, translation is vitally important, and we've managed to do quite a lot of translation work into children's books in Scots, but the next stage I think is to try to produce some of the great classics of European and other literatures in Scots for grown-up readers as well.
Is that the next step? I mean, for the language to be taken seriously.
I think it's one of a number of steps. I think if people can be persuaded that, for example, Franz Kafka or Dostoevsky, somebody who's actually has translated, although it's not been published yet, has translated Crime and Punishment into Scots, and it's the most astonishing read. But it's a different read in Scots than it is in English, and he's actually translated it from the Russian. I dare say it's a different read than it is in the Russian, but I don't know Russian. But I think that is an example of how you can mature a literature. But we shouldn't also forget that, in fact, Scots has a very long pedigree, and one of the earliest and most magnificent pieces of written Scots was Gavin Douglas's translation of the Aeneid from Latin into Scots in the early 16th century. And I think I'm right in saying that was the first translation of Virgil into a vernacular European language ever. So there is a long pedigree there.
As whilst admitting the importance of translation in building bridges and sharing ideas, I think it's important as well that literatures and writing and traditions. I'm trying to find a way of not predicating the fact that it has to be written, because I'm going to come to Angus now. It's important that literatures are allowed to function and exist within their own parameters. Could you expand on the predominance of the oral tradition within Gaelic literature, and is it a matter of regret or a matter of hope that things have developed in recent years as they have?
Well, to reflect is the same as Scots. Of course, there is a rich literary tradition in Gaelic as well, back from the Book of Deer in the 6th century to various high art and poetry and theological collections. But as a peasant language, it was an oral language rather than a literary language. So literary, I mean, of course, for the intelligentsia in Gaelic society, it was a written language. But for me and my people and everybody I've known for the last 7 generations back, they could not read or write in their own language. But I think what it does is challenge, what is language? What am I doing here speaking? Why am I in London? I came in the sleeper last night. And honestly, there were more people at Euston Station than I ever meet in a whole year. So I'm trying to translate my experience, my life, into language. And I mean, Alys and Jim has touched on that. Every word you stumble over, as I am at the moment, in a foreign language, and every sentence I write, and every poem I write, and every novel I write, is an attempt at translating the untranslatable. So it's all translation. And so you challenge yourself, what is your life about, and what is your literature about? I'm exactly the same. I wrote this novel exclusively in Gaelic, but I published a book, Nyan Idilnashik, The Girl on the Ferryboat, simultaneously in English and Gaelic. I wrote them simultaneously. I had 2 laptops, and I was writing one in Gaelic and one in English. And they were both just versions of what could be possible. And like any writer will tell you, once you finish your novel, you think, right, that's what it was about. I can start again, because you only understand at the end what actually you were trying to say. So it's a kind of raid on the inarticulate, I think, as Eliot said. And it's so deep. There used to be a pub in South Uist called Polhara in the old days, in the 1960s and 70s, and women weren't allowed into it. They weren't, not that they weren't allowed, but they wouldn't enter the premises. But there was this was pre-toilet. There were no toilets in those days, but there was an outside urinal, which consisted of a cement wall with a toilet behind and no roof over your head. So you would stand there, and peeing in a row, like the 6 of us, as we would stand here. Excuse, we're post-gender, of course, nowadays. You'd stand there, and in the south end of South Uist, people speak very gutturally in Gaelic. And on Gaelic radio, there's a program twice a week called Lichter at Balochianschi, Letter for Learners. And the presenter speaks very slowly. Mathing va, falche erev, go London. Welcome to London. And I just want to do a letter for natives from South Uist that nobody would understand. You just go, they wouldn't even understand it in North Uist or Lewis. I mean, it's a dialect, if you wanted that, or a language contained within 8 or 9 villages at the south end of South Uist. And as you stood there peeing in the dark, you would hear this guttural imprecations from various folk beside you. And then the word Mars, Venus. And there was a whole astrological, astronomical, ontological, theological universe being discussed in this native language. So how on earth do I begin to translate that into my own experience and beyond? The last book I wrote, I kind of challenged myself in that. It's called Memory and Straw, and it's written in English. And one day, as I was there on the internet, it dawned on me, oh my God, belief in fairies and the internet are the same thing. You enter this fairy knoll, and magic things happen, and you emerge changed from it. And the algorithms of the 18th century, whether that was the minister telling you, thou shalt not commit English-speaking things, or whether it's, what's his name, Zuckerberg, selling all these private details of mine to Cambridge Analytica. It's exactly the same thing. A universe within a universe which is alien and external. And how do you enter it? Because you want to enter the magic kingdom. Because if you entered a fairy knoll in the old days, oh my God, a woman with red hair down to here who was naked would take you, and you would be there for 100 years, at least, hopefully. And you would emerge changed. So what was all that about? Of course it was about taboos, and it was about restrictions, and about what your society was. So in this kind of memory and straw, I challenged myself to say, well, how do I, with all this stuff about men peeing and Venus and Mars and fairies and my parents and Gaelic taken away from me, and mass and short trousers and the man in the moon and Neil Armstrong, and he was Scottish, wasn't he? How do I get all that into talking to my children who sit around the table and look at me and think, And then we have a rhyme that goes, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rank, Rankin Roddy, Rankin Roddy. I never get it right, because they're all musicians. And they say, no, Dad, you haven't got it right. So they say it right. When you're on the sleeper tomorrow, instead of singing Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rank, just say it quietly to yourself. Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, Roddy Rankin, until you get the beat. But I don't get the beat, because it's in English. I can only get the beat in Gaelic. So I'm saying, Roddy Rankin, and then I get it right. So what I'm saying is that translation, of course, is important. But I don't know how to translate myself, Alys. I don't know how to translate myself. And I think the challenge that we have, and my children have, in the year 2018, is how to not be interpreted or translated from the outside by someone else, but to translate themselves and say, here I am with my pipes and my kilt if need be, articulating and telling our own world as it is. And there are so few of us. So few of us. What was that song? And they're all dead. Damn few and they're all dead. Sorry, I should go to the mod and sing. What else was I going to say? Oh, Ian, honey, one other thing. I knew an old man in South Uist. He was 3 houses along from me when I grew up, and he was 100 years of age when I knew him in 1957, and he died 5 years ago at the age of 97. Little man, etc. And a reporter from the Washington Post came to discover his ancestry in Uist in 2001. And halfway through this article in the Washington Post, it said, I arrived in Lochboysdale and they told me, go and see Ian Honey. And I went to see Ian Honey. And then it says, through an interpreter, Ian Honey told me such and such. So he was, in a sense, the last monoglot Gaelic speaker only 13 or 14 years ago. So when I think somebody stated earlier, we're all bilingual now. I wonder whether really we are, because I know so many people of my generation, like you're saying, you're not as confident in English, Sian, whose world really is Gaelic.
Thank you. Well, I think we have to draw things to a close now. However, I think the important thing that comes out of that is that the spoken word and the written word need not necessarily be set up in opposition to each other. And certainly in Welsh literature over the last few decades, there's been an increasing awareness and appreciation of the richness that exists within the spoken language that can be accessed and brought within the written medium. We shouldn't think of them as being in opposition. To close, I'm going to, in best Paxman style, ask each of our panelists to give us a sentence, a takeaway thought, what they would like to see that would improve the lot of writing or publishing or literature in general in their respective languages. And I'm going to start with Shan.
Right. I know what I want to do. I don't know how to do it. But what I want is that in some way we have more opportunity to skip over English, skip over England, and get our work out of this binary English-Welsh, England-Wales situation we're in too often.
I think for Scots publishing and Scots literature generally, I would like to see something equivalent to what exists for Gaelic, the Gaelic Books Council established for Scots, so that we could actually really increase the volume, the number of books being written in being published in Scots. It wouldn't require a vast amount of money, but I think we need to incentivise publishers who are not currently interested in publishing in Scots to do so, and I think that would open up a whole new ballgame both for children's and adult literature in Scots.
Alys.
I would like to see, I think, the key to this is that the development of our literatures, it does not mean a mirroring of what is happening across the border. So it's not just about growth and sales and following global trends or these kind of things at all. It needs to be rooted in our culture and in our communities. And for that, what we need is a really grassroots investment in local literature projects, in local literature magazines. For example, in North Wales, we need an awful lot more of that kind of input so that people are producing literature locally, as they always have, because that is what is so different about our tradition and our kind of literature. Shan or I or the poets of the past as well have always been in dialogue with community, and we need to keep that dialogue open in order for us to have anything to export. Otherwise, there's just a flattening of our culture, and I think that would be that is where we'll lose ourselves, in fact, internationalizing and internationalizing nothing because we've gone.
I think exactly. I think it's just the balance between. I think in terms of Gaelic, I think it's terribly, terribly important to stress a part of what Alys is saying there is that we have a long history that has pushed us back geographically, as well as in every other alley, so that increasingly we've been confined to the northwest of Scotland. And I think it's important for my children and for the coming generation to realise and to know and to be verified that they are international citizens, that their colleagues are Milan Kundera and Italo Calvino and Haldor Laxness and Alice Munro and Alice Conran and others, and that they're not confined to some kind of Gaelic manse kitchen out in Scalpay in the Outer Hebrides, that they are international citizens. And meantime, to be strengthened in terms of their own communities, that writing and literature and reading is as exciting and as legitimate as any other activity to engage in. James and I were talking earlier, 20 years ago in Scotland there was something like 20 or 25 writers in residence. I think it's down to 2 now. So that work that's so important in communities has just been decimated with this bloody austerity package that's going on, and it needs to be readdressed, and needs to be readdressed quickly. And just one final quote for myself and for the issue I'm talking about. I'm always love the quote from Kundera, who says the only duty of a writer is to write well, not to save a language, not to save a culture, not to historically trawl this, that and the other, is to write well. What it is to write well, I don't know, but Faulkner's speech when he won the Nobel Prize in 1949 is worth reading, because it was so short, and it was like myself, nobody could make out what he was saying because he was drunk and he just kind of mumbled into the microphone. And then you read this bloody page and you think, wow, that's what it is to write well. So write well, establish community stuff, and remember that they don't live just in Skye, but in Stalingrad or San Francisco or wherever it may be.
Thank you to all our panellists. Whilst our various literatures face challenges, I hope we've at least shown a little glimpse to you of the vibrancy that exists within them. Thank you to the panellists for sharing their experiences. I hope that's a dialogue that will continue. So join me in thanking one last time Sian Northey, James Robertson, Alys Conran and Angus Campbell.